When I arrived at my brother's wedding, my seat was a stool by the exit. No meal, no place card, no recognition. His wife's family whispered, "He's just the backup son." So I hurried out with the $5,200 check I'd slipped in their card box. 10 minutes later, I heard him yelling down the hall. Where is he? I 32M should have seen it coming. The signs were all there, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to this moment of humiliation. But sometimes you're so desperate to believe in family that you ignore the obvious. The venue was gorgeous, some upscale country club that probably cost more than my car. Valet parking, ice sculptures, the works. My brother had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. I'd made peace with that years ago, or so I thought. Walking into the reception hall, I searched for my name among the elegant place cards arranged on an ornate table near the entrance. Table 1, Table 2, Table 3. I kept scanning, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as other guests found their seats with ease. The wedding coordinator, a woman with an overly bright smile, approached me when she noticed my confusion. She asked if I needed help finding my seat, and I gave her my name. Her expression shifted slightly as she checked her clipboard, then checked it again. She told me there seemed to be a mix-up and asked me to wait while she sorted it out. 5 minutes turned into 10. Other guests were already seated, servers were beginning to pour wine, and I was still standing there like an idiot. The coordinator returned with what looked like apologetic embarrassment and led me toward the back of the room. That's when I saw it. A folding stool, not even a proper chair, positioned right by the emergency exit, partially hidden behind a decorative plant. No place card, no table number, no meal setting. Just a bare stool that looked like it had been grabbed from a storage closet. The coordinator explained that there had been some last-minute changes to the seating arrangements, and this was the best they could do. She assured me that dinner would be brought to me separately. The way she avoided eye contact told me everything I needed to know. I sat down on that stool and watched as my brother's new in-laws filled the front tables. His wife's family was old money, the kind of people who wore their wealth like a comfortable sweater. They belonged to the same country club, summered in the Hamptons, and had the sort of casual confidence that comes from never having to worry about anything. That's when I heard it. Two of the bride's aunts were sitting at the table closest to me, speaking in those stage whispers that rich people think are subtle but actually carry perfectly. One of them mentioned how nice it was that the family was so inclusive, even inviting distant relatives. The other one laughed softly and said something that made my blood freeze. She called me the backup son, explaining to her companion that some families keep spare children around just in case. They both found this hilarious. The backup son. That phrase hit me like a physical blow. I thought about the $5,200 check I'd tucked into their card box earlier. It represented months of savings, overtime shifts I'd picked up specifically to give them something meaningful. I'd wanted to be generous, to show that despite everything, I supported their happiness. The irony wasn't lost on me. My brother was making his rounds, greeting guests with his new wife on his arm. They moved from table to table like royalty accepting tribute. When they reached the area near me, he gave me a brief nod, the kind you'd give a waiter or someone whose name you couldn't quite remember. His wife didn't acknowledge me at all. I sat there for another 20 minutes, watching the celebration unfold around me. The photographer captured every moment of joy and laughter, but somehow the camera never panned in my direction. It was as if I existed in some invisible bubble, present but not really there. The turning point came when dinner service began. Servers emerged from the kitchen carrying elaborate plates to each table. I watched as everyone else received their meals, some fancy surf and turf creation that looked like it belonged in a magazine. I waited for my promised separate meal, but nothing came. When I flagged down a server, she looked confused and said she hadn't been told about any special arrangements. She promised to check with the kitchen, but I could see in her eyes that nothing was coming. I was the forgotten guest at my own brother's wedding. That's when something inside me snapped. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, but with the quiet certainty that comes when you finally understand exactly where you stand. I wasn't family here. I was a courtesy invitation, a box check to avoid potential drama. The backup son, as they'd so eloquently put it. I stood up from my stool and walked calmly toward the exit. The card box sat on an ornate table near the entrance, overflowing with envelopes and wrapped gifts. I reached in and retrieved my envelope, the thick one with their names written in my careful handwriting. No one noticed. No one was watching the backup son slip away. The envelope felt heavier than it should have as I walked to my car. $5,200. Enough to pay off my credit card debt and maybe take that vacation I'd been putting off for years. Money I'd saved by eating ramen and skipping social events. Also, I could be generous to a brother who'd given me a stool by the exit. I was halfway home when my phone started buzzing. Text after text, then calls. I let them all go to voicemail. The first few messages were from my brother, his tone escalating from confused to frantic to angry. He demanded to know where I was, why I'd left, and most importantly, where his envelope was. The voicemails painted a picture of chaos back at the reception. Apparently, someone had noticed the missing envelope when they were organizing the gifts. My brother had checked with the venue, thinking maybe it had been misplaced. When they reviewed the security footage, they saw me retrieving it. His final voicemail was the most telling. His voice was tight with barely controlled rage as he called me selfish and ungrateful. He said I was ruining his wedding day over hurt feelings, that I needed to grow up and stop making everything about myself. He demanded I return immediately with the money. The irony was beautiful. For once in our lives, I had something he needed, and he couldn't just take it. The golden child was learning what it felt like to be disappointed. I drove to a 24-hour diner and ordered coffee and pie. Real food, served at a real table, by a waitress who called me Han and refilled my cup without being asked. It was more hospitality than I'd received at a wedding I'd helped pay for. My phone kept buzzing. Text messages from relatives who'd somehow gotten word of the drama. Most of them were taking his side, painting me as the bitter younger brother who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. A few asked for my side of the story, but I could tell they'd already made up their minds. The most painful message came from our mother. She was disappointed in me, she said. This was supposed to be a celebration of love and family, and I'd turned it into something ugly. She asked me to think about what our father would have said, which was particularly cruel since Dad had been gone for 3 years. What Dad would have said was probably something about how the golden child could do no wrong, even when he was wrong. Dad had never hidden his favoritism, though he'd dress it up in language about potential and responsibility. My brother was the future of the family name. I was just there. Update 1. The next morning brought a new wave of communications. My brother had apparently spent the remainder of his wedding reception dealing with the fallout from my disappearance. Several relatives had approached him asking about the missing envelope, forcing him to admit that his own brother had walked out on his wedding. His new wife was reportedly mortified. Her family, those same people who'd whispered about backup sons, were now treating this as confirmation of what they'd suspected about my brother's family. We weren't their kind of people, and this drama proved it. My brother showed up at my apartment around noon. I watched through the peephole as he pounded on my door, his tuxedo wrinkled and his hair disheveled. He looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. He called my name through the door, alternating between demands and pleas. He told me we needed to talk, that this whole situation had gotten out of hand. He promised we could work things out if I'd just open the door and listen to reason. When I didn't respond, his tone shifted. He reminded me about family loyalty, about all the times he'd looked out for me growing up, about how disappointed our parents would be. What he didn't mention was the stool. He didn't acknowledge that seating me like an unwanted guest at my own brother's wedding might have been hurtful. He didn't apologize for treating me like I was invisible, or for letting his wife's family mock me within earshot. In his mind, the problem wasn't his behavior, it was my reaction to it. I waited until he left before opening the door. In the hallway where he'd been standing, he'd left a handwritten note. It was shorter than his voicemails, but somehow more desperate. He wrote that he understood I was hurt, but taking the money was theft. He needed that cash for the honeymoon they'd planned, and keeping it would hurt his new wife too. The note ended with a promise that we could discuss my concerns after he returned from his trip, but right now he needed me to do the right thing. The right thing, apparently, was returning money I'd given as a gift after being treated like garbage at his wedding. I kept the note, but didn't respond. Instead, I did something I'd never done before. I blocked his number. Then I blocked our mother's number, and most of our relatives. For the first time in my adult life, the constant background noise of family expectations went silent. Update 2. 2 weeks passed in blissful quiet. I used some of the money to pay off my credit card debt and put the rest in savings. Without the pressure of family obligations, I found myself sleeping better and feeling lighter than I had in years. That changed when my brother showed up at my workplace. He'd somehow convinced building security to let him up to my floor, claiming to be delivering an urgent family message. My coworkers watched with uncomfortable curiosity as he made his scene in our lobby. He looked terrible. The honeymoon tin couldn't hide the stress lines around his eyes, and he'd lost weight. His new wife stood beside him, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. This was her first time meeting me face to face, and the circumstances couldn't have been more awkward. My brother's voice carried across the lobby as he explained that they'd had to cut their honeymoon short because of money problems. The missing envelope had apparently been earmarked for specific expenses, and without it, they'd been forced to use credit cards for everything. He painted me as the villain who'd ruined their romantic getaway out of petty jealousy. His wife finally spoke up, asking me directly why I'd taken their wedding gift. Her tone was more curious than accusatory, like she genuinely wanted to understand what had happened. I could see why my brother had fallen for her. She had a directness that was almost refreshing. I told her about the stool, about sitting by the exit like uninvited help while her family mocked me within earshot, about waiting for a meal that never came while everyone else enjoyed their surf and turf, about being treated like the backup son at my own brother's wedding. Her expression changed as I spoke. She turned to look at my brother with something that might have been surprise or disappointment. She asked him if what I was saying was true, and his stammered response told her everything she needed to know. The lobby had gone quiet. My coworkers weren't even pretending not to listen anymore. This family drama was better than anything on television, and they had front row seats. My brother tried to salvage the situation by minimizing what had happened. He claimed there had been honest mistakes with the seating arrangements, that the venue had messed up the meal service, that these things happen at big events. He suggested I was being overly sensitive about minor inconveniences. His wife wasn't buying it. She asked him directly why I'd been seated on a stool while her drunk cousin got a prime table assignment. She wanted to know why no one had noticed I hadn't been served dinner. Most importantly, she asked why he hadn't mentioned any of this when he'd spent 2 weeks complaining about me stealing their money. The truth was coming out, and my brother was scrambling to contain it. He tried to redirect the conversation back to the money, insisting that whatever had happened at the wedding didn't justify theft. His voice was getting louder, more desperate, as he realized he was losing control of the narrative. That's when building security arrived. Someone had called them about the disturbance in the lobby. My brother found himself being politely but firmly escorted from the building while his wife followed in obvious embarrassment. As the elevator doors closed, I could see her asking him questions he clearly didn't want to answer. Update 3. The final confrontation came a month later, at our mother's house during what was supposed to be a family dinner. I'd been avoiding these gatherings since the wedding, but Mom had guilted me into coming by claiming she was worried about the family falling apart. The moment I walked in, I knew it was a setup. My brother was there with his wife, along with several aunts and uncles who'd been recruited as witnesses. They'd prepared what amounted to an intervention, complete with talking points about family forgiveness and moving forward. Mom had cooked my favorite meal, which felt like emotional manipulation of the highest order. She served it on her best china while speaking about the importance of family unity and letting go of past hurts. Everyone nodded along like this was wisdom instead of guilt-tripping. My brother had clearly been coached. He offered what sounded like a prepared apology for the seating arrangement and dinner mix-up. He acknowledged that mistakes had been made and feelings had been hurt. He even admitted that some of his wife's family members had been less than welcoming. But then came the but. There's always a but with apologies like this. He said that while he understood my hurt feelings, my response had been disproportionate and damaging. He claimed that taking the money had caused financial hardship and embarrassment that went far beyond whatever slight I'd experienced. His wife sat quietly through most of this, but I could see her processing everything. She'd married into this family expecting normal dysfunction, not whatever this was. The more she learned about the wedding incident, the less comfortable she looked. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I told them about sitting on that stool, about being called the backup son, about being forgotten and dismissed at what should have been a family celebration. I explained that the money wasn't stolen. It was a gift I'd decided not to give to people who'd treated me like I didn't matter. The room went quiet. Some of the relatives looked genuinely shocked, like they were hearing this version of events for the first time. Others seemed uncomfortable, probably wondering what role they'd played in the whole mess. My brother's wife finally spoke up. She told the room that she'd checked with the wedding coordinator, who'd confirmed that my seating arrangement had been a last-minute instruction from the groom's family. She'd also spoken to several of her relatives, who'd admitted to making comments about backup sons and spare children. The revelation that my brother had been directly involved in my humiliation changed everything. This wasn't a series of innocent mistakes or venue mix-ups. It was deliberate exclusion, planned and executed by my own family. Mom tried to salvage the situation by suggesting we all bore some responsibility and needed to focus on healing rather than blame. But the damage was done. The truth was out, and it was uglier than anyone had wanted to admit. I stood up to leave, and my brother made one final desperate attempt to fix things. He offered to return my place in the family, to include me properly in future events, to make sure I was treated with respect. All I had to do was return their money and pretend this had never happened. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I'd never noticed before. Behind all that golden child confidence was fear. Fear that his perfect image was cracking, that his new wife was seeing him clearly, that the family dynamics he'd always benefited from were finally being questioned. I told him he could keep his promises. I'd learned that being family didn't automatically mean being treated with basic human dignity. I'd also learned that I didn't need their approval or inclusion to have value. As I walked toward the door, my brother's wife called my name. She told me she was sorry for what had happened at their wedding, and that she wished she'd known about it sooner. She seemed genuinely regretful, which made me feel slightly better about keeping their money. My brother followed me to my car, making one last attempt to guilt me into compliance. He said I was tearing the family apart over money, that our father would be ashamed of what I'd become. He predicted that I'd regret this decision when I was old and alone, with no family to support me. I told him I'd rather be alone than tolerated. I'd rather have dignity than acceptance based on making myself smaller for their comfort. The $5,200 wasn't about money. It was about finally putting a price on my self-respect. 6 months later, I heard through mutual friends that my brother's marriage was struggling. Apparently, the wedding incident had been a symptom of larger issues with honesty and family dynamics. His wife had started questioning other aspects of their relationship, wondering what else he'd hidden or misrepresented. I felt bad for her, but not for him. He'd created this mess by prioritizing appearances over substance, by treating family members like disposable accessories to his perfect life. The golden child was learning that real relationships require more than charm and entitlement. As for me, I used the money for a down payment on a small house in a different part of town. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine. I've built new friendships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. I date someone who thinks I'm worth a real chair at the table, not a stool by the exit. Sometimes I wonder if I'll regret cutting ties with my family. But then I remember that feeling of sitting alone on that stool, being mocked by strangers while my own brother pretended I didn't exist. Some prices are too high to pay, even for family. The backup son has left the building, and he's not coming back.